and welcome to another episode of The Word for Kids. I'm Jaymie.
And I'm Josh.
And we're guiding you through the book of Matthew in a series of 20 episodes. Last time, we learned about Jesus talking to his disciples about the day he would come back to earth. He told them no one knows the day or the hour, and because of this, they should keep watch, or as we might say, be ready. To explain his point, Jesus told two parables.
The first is the parable of the 10 virgins. In this story, these 10 young, unmarried women were acting as bridesmaids to the bride and groom. One of their responsibilities was to wait for the groom to arrive at the bride's house and then walk with him to the groom's house, lighting the way with their lamps. So there were 10 of these ladies, but only 5 of them were wise. The other 5 were foolish. They waited a long time for the groom, and at midnight, news came that he was on his way. But the foolish virgins began to worry about their lamps. They worried that they would go out because they had not brought any extra oil. So they had to go to town and buy more oil. But while they were gone, the groom finally arrived. And the 5 wise virgins were the only ones there. So they escorted him to the wedding banquet, and they were invited in with him. When the others came back, the groom turned them away and said, "Truly, I don't know you."
The second parable is called the parable of the bags of gold. In this story, a man gave his money to 3 servants. The first, he gave 5 bags of gold. To the second, he gave 2 bags, and to the third, 1 bag of gold, according to their ability. The first servant worked with the 5 bags of gold he was given and earned 5 more bags. The servant who was given 2 bags gained 2 more. But the servant who was only given 1 bag of gold dug a hole and buried it. And when the man returned, each servant went to him and showed what they'd done with his money. To the first and second servants he said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." But the servant with only 1 bag of gold said he was afraid and had hid the gold in the ground. The man called that servant wicked and lazy and gave that bag of gold to the servant who now had 10. And that's where we left off last time. Are you ready for today's adventure? Let's go!
Jesus said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people.
While Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. But when the disciples saw this, they were indignant, which means they were very angry and offended. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." But Jesus said, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on me, she did it to prepare my body for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her."
Jesus knew he was going to be killed very soon. He was trying to help his disciples understand this. Jesus had accepted this was God the Father's plan for him and was willingly preparing for this instead of fighting or running away. It's really pretty incredible when you think about it. In those days, when a person died, the women in their lives would anoint them with oil to prepare them to be buried. This woman, in pouring her expensive perfume on Jesus, had actually prepared him to be buried before he had even died. And Jesus called her gift a beautiful thing.
Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" The 12 is just a nickname for the 12 main disciples who joined Jesus during his ministry on earth. So Judas asked the chief priests what he would get for giving them Jesus. They counted out 30 pieces of silver, and from then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. For comparison, these 30 pieces of silver were worth far less than the expensive perfume the woman had just anointed Jesus with. Judas was willing to give Jesus over to be crucified, and the price for his betrayal wasn't even very high.
The last passage we'll talk about today is called the Lord's Supper. It's called this because this was the last time the disciples and Jesus would gather like this before Jesus was crucified. This took place on the first day of the Festival of Unleavened Bread. The disciples asked Jesus where he wanted to eat the Passover feast. Remember back in Exodus, when the Israelites were trying to get out of Egypt, and God sent all the plagues on the Egyptians so that Pharaoh would finally let the people go? In the last plague, the firstborn son of all the families would pass away. But the Israelites sacrificed lambs and put the blood of the lambs on the door frames. When death came across the land, it passed over the Israelites' houses who had sacrificed lambs, and their sons were saved. This Passover feast was a yearly reminder to the Jews, who were descendants of those Israelites, of God's protection over his people. And this Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples took place during the Passover, symbolic of how Jesus was now becoming a sacrificial lamb himself.
So Jesus told the disciples to go into the city and tell a certain man, the teacher says, I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. The disciples did as Jesus said and prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the disciples. He said, Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. They were very sad and began to say to him one after the other, Surely you don't mean me, Lord. And Jesus replied, The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. Well, it turned out Judas was the one who had dipped his hand into the bowl. And he said, Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. Jesus simply answered, You have said so.
While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, Take and eat. This is my body. Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
We now call this special part of the Last Supper communion, and we still do this today.
This is actually where our story ends for today, and it's time for the verse to remember. Today's verse is Ephesians 1:7. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace. Ephesians 1:7.
Every time I read through this part of the story, I'm more and more amazed at what Jesus came to do and how he so willingly accepted his fate. At the same time, I understand why the disciples were so confused and frustrated and even angry at times. They didn't have the full knowledge of the future. I imagine how scary it would be to hear Jesus say that this woman who had just poured perfume on him was actually preparing him to be buried, even though he was obviously still alive right there with them. The disciples had complete faith in Jesus and had sacrificed their livelihoods to follow him, yet he was just accepting his upcoming death and not choosing to fight or run away from those trying to kill him. I imagine they wondered what this would mean for them. And those of us who follow Jesus now, we are disciples too, and we will all experience this wondering and confusion and struggle to understand why things happen the way they do. And that's okay. We don't have all the answers yet. We may not fully understand until we get to heaven, but we can put our trust in Jesus, who became a sacrificial lamb for us.
Yeah, it's really exciting that we had learned just a few years ago about the first Passover, and then to see Jesus and his disciples celebrating that same special event that showed God's salvation he provided for his people. And now we see Jesus become one final Passover lamb.
That's pretty incredible, and it's so cool to see how the whole Bible works together to tell this amazing story. Well, that's all we have for this week. I can't wait to see you again soon for another episode of The Word for Kids.